Hey, hello everybody. We're on to our next chapters. And yes, I'm reading these chapters all in one night so I can make sure to get them to you right away. That's why you see me dressed in the same clothes. I think though I may be able to, my granddaughter's going to come stay with me again. So hopefully I'll get to record some reading with her and it'll be another day. So you'll see me in different clothes. But hopefully you'll get to see her read. She's also a third grader, Peyton. But let's go ahead and continue with our Despereaux. So the last chapter, they were taking the princess to the dungeon, Rescuro and Mig, and the princess pretended that she didn't know who Rescuro was, but she knew who he was. So, chapter 38, to the dungeon. The strange threesome made their way down the golden stairs of the castle. The princess and Mig walked side by side, and Roscuro hid himself again in the pocket of Mig's apron. And Mig pointed the sharp tip of the knife at the princess's back, and together they went down, down, down. The princess was led to her fate as around her everyone slept. The king slept in his giant bed with his crown on his head and his hands crossed on his chest, dreaming that his wife, the queen, was a bird with green and gold feathers, who called his name, Philip, 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 without ceasing. Cook slept in a too small bed off the kitchen, dreaming of a recipe for soup that she could not find. Where did I put that? She mumbled in her sleep. Where did that recipe go? It was for the queen's favorite soup. I must find it. And not far from Cook, in the pantry, atop a bag of flour, slept the mouse Despereaux, dreaming, as you know, reader, of the knights in shining armor, of darkness and of light. And in the whole of the darkened sleeping castle there was only the light of the candle in the hand of Miggery Sow. The candle shone on the princess's dress and made it sparkle, and the princess walked tall in the light and tried not to be afraid. In this story, reader, we have talked about the heart of the mouse, and the heart of the rat, and the heart of the serving girl, Miggery Sow. But we have not talked about the heart of the princess. Like most hearts, it was complicated, shaded with dark, and dappled with light. The dark things in the princess's heart were these: a very small, very hot, burning coal of hatred for the rat who was responsible for her mother's death. And the other darkness was a tremendous sorrow, a deep sadness that her mother was dead and the princess could now only talk to her in her dreams. And what of the light in the princess's heart? Reader, I am pleased to tell you that the P was a kind person, and perhaps more important, she was empathetic. Do you know what it means to be empathetic? You should. I think we talked about it this year. I will tell you. It means that when you are being forcibly taken to a dungeon, when you have a large knife pointed at your back, and when you are trying to be brave, you are able still to think for a moment of the person who's holding that knife, meaning she's feeling sorry for Mig. She's being empathetic. You are able to think, oh, poor Mig. She wants to be a princess so badly, and she thinks this is the way. Poor, poor Mig. What must it be like to want something that desperately? That, reader, is empathy. And now you have a small map of the princess's heart: hatred, sorrow, kindness, and empathy. The heart that she carried inside her as she went down the golden stairs and through the kitchen, and finally, just as the sky outside the castle began to lighten, down into the dark of the dungeon with the rat and the serving girl. Oh. Chapter 39, Missing. The sun rose and shed light on what Roscuro and Miggery Sow had done, and finally Despereaux awoke. But alas, he awoke too late. I haven't seen her, Louise was shouting, and I tell you, I wash my hands of her. If she is missing, I say good riddance. Good riddance to bad rubbish. Despereaux sat up. He looked behind him. Oh, his tail! Gone! Given over to the knife, and where the tail should be, nothing but a bloody stub. And more foul play. Gregory dead, shouted Cook. Poor old man, that rope of his broken by who knows what, and him lost in the dark, and frightened to death because of it. It's too much. Oh no, whispered Despereaux. Oh no, Gregory is dead. The mouse got to his feet and began the long climb down from the shelf. Once he was on the floor, he stuck his head around the door of the pantry and saw Cook standing in the center of the kitchen, wringing her fat hands. Beside her stood a tall woman, jangling a ring of keys. That's right, said Louise. All the king's men was down there searching for her in the dungeon, and then they come back up. Who do they have with them? They have the old man, dead. And now you tell me that Mig is missing, and I say, who cares? Despereaux made a small noise of despair. He had slept too long. The rat had already acted. The princess was gone. And what kind of world is it, Miss Louise, where princesses are taken from right under our noses, and queens drop dead, and we cannot even take comfort in soup? And with this, Cook started to cry. Shh, said Louise. I beg you, do not say that word. Soup, shouted Cook. I will say it. No one can stop me. Soup, soup, soup. And then she began to cry in earnest, wailing and sobbing. There, said Louise. She put a hand out to touch Cook, and Cook slapped it away. It will be all right, said Louise. Cook brought the hem of her apron up to wipe her eyes. It won't, she said. It won't be all right ever again. They've taken our little darling away. There ain't nothing left to live for without the princess. Despereaux was amazed to have exactly what was in his heart spoken aloud by such a ferocious, mouse-hating woman as Cook. Louise again reached out to touch Cook, and this time Cook allowed her to put an arm around her shoulder. What will we do? What will we do? Wailed Cook, and Louise said, Shh, there. Alas, there was no one to comfort Despereaux. And there was no time anyway for him to cry. He knew what he had to do. He had to find the king. For having heard Risquero's plan, reader, Despereaux knew that the princess was hidden in the dungeon. And being somewhat smarter than Miggery Sow, he sensed the terrible unspoken truth behind Risquero's words. He knew that Mig could never be a princess. He knew that the rat, once he captured the pea, would never let her go. And so the small mouse, who had been dipped in oil, covered in flour, and relieved of his tail, slipped out of the pantry past the weeping ladies. He went to find the king. How long is this chapter? I think I'll go ahead and read one more chapter. Chapter 40, Forgiveness. He went first to the throne room, but the king was not there. And so Despereaux slipped through a hole in the molding and was making his way to the princess's room when he came upon the mouse council. 13 mice and one most very honored head mouse, sitting around their piece of wood debating important mouse matters. Despereaux stopped and stood very still. Fellow honored mice, said the most very honored head mouse, and then he looked up from the makeshift table and saw Despereaux. Yes, he whispered. The other mice of the council leaned forward, straining to make some sense of the word that the head mouse had just uttered. Pardon? One said. Excuse me? Said another. I didn't hear right, said a third. I thought you said Despereaux. The head mouse gathered himself. He tried speaking up again. Fellow members, he said, a ghost, a ghost. And he raised a shaking paw and pointed it at Despereaux. The other mice turned and looked, and there was Despereaux Tilling, covered in flour, looking back at them, the telltale red thread still around his neck, like a thin trail of blood. Despereaux, said Lester. Son, you've come back. Despereaux looked at his father and saw an old mouse whose fur was shot through with gray. How could that be? Despereaux had only been gone a few days, but his father seemed to have aged many years in his absence. Son, ghost of my son, said Lester, his whiskers trembling. I dreamt about you every night. I dreamt about beating the drum that sent you to your death. I was wrong. What I did was wrong. No, called the most very honored head mouse. No. I've destroyed it, said Lester. I've destroyed the drum. Will you forgive me? He clapped his front paws together and looked at his son. No, shouted the head mouse again. No, do not ask the ghost to forgive you, Lester. You did as you should. You did what was best for the mouse community. So here they are. And there's Despereaux, all white because he's in flower. So because he's white, they think he's a ghost. Lester ignored the head mouse. Son, he said, please. Despereaux looked at his father, at his gray streaked fur and trembling whiskers, and his front paws clasped together in front of his heart. And he felt suddenly as if his own heart would break in two. His father looked so small, so sad. Forgive me, said Lester again. Forgiveness, reader, is, I think, something very much like hope and love. A powerful, wonderful thing, and a ridiculous thing, too. Isn't it ridiculous, after all, to think that a son could forgive his father for beating the drum that sent him to his death? Isn't it ridiculous to think that a mouse could ever forgive anyone for such perfidy? Remember, we looked at perfidy. But still, here are the words Despereaux Tilling spoke to his father. He said, I forgive you, Pa. And he said those words because he sensed that it was the only way to save his own heart, to stop it from breaking in two. Despereaux, reader, spoke those words to save himself. And then he turned from his father and spoke to the whole mouse council. You were wrong, he said, all of you. You asked me to renounce my sins. I asked you to renounce yours. You wronged me. Repent. Never, said Head Mouse. Despereaux stood before the Mouse Council, and he realized that he was a different mouse than he had been the last time he faced them. He had been to the dungeon and back up out of it. He knew things that they would never know. What they thought of him, he realized, did not matter. Not at all. And so, without saying another word, Despereaux turned and left the room. After he was gone, the head mouse slapped his trembling paw on the table. Mice of the council, he said, we have been paid a visit by a ghost who has told us to repent. We will now take a vote. All in favor of saying this visit did not occur, say aye. And from the members of the council, there came a tiny but emphatic chorus of ayes. Only one mouse said nothing. That mouse was Despereaux's father. Lester Tilling had turned his head away from the other members of the Mouse Council. He was trying to hide his tears. He was crying, reader, because he had been forgiven. So he was happy that his son forgave him. Oh, this is getting even better. All right. Chapter 41, The Tears of a King. And that's what we'll read next time. Okay. So have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're listening to this. And remember, I love you.